The GDR was ultimately unsuccessful in shutting down or controlling the church as an ideological opponent. And as someone who was actively involved in the church, were there any instances when the GDR came close to silencing the church? And if so, when and how did that affect religious movements throughout East Germany?
So the communist regime in East Germany didn't want to have an influential church in the country because that was, an opposition of this communist regime, and therefore they made the life of people who were members of the church and who were active in the church difficult. They prevented them from higher education. They wouldn't allow them a career in the civil service or elsewhere in the society. And that was very successful. People left the church for this reason, or people before the wall was built left the country because they didn't want to live in a society where they couldn't stick to their beliefs and could be a member of the church. But there were times of bigger and not as big oppression of the church. And the hardest time, I guess, was in the 50s when the government and the police and the secret police went particularly against the future of the church, against young people. So they would summon them to the secret police and ask them what they do in the youth groups. They would make youth camps in the summer illegal. My father was a young minister in this time, and he was summoned several times. And he was told that he doesn't have the right to preach to these young people, to gather them. And they did anyway. But as I said, not everybody wanted to live this life. And so they left the country, and they also made the churches weaker, but they didn't silence the churches totally.
What were the main differences between the East German and West German education systems?
So there were many differences. The East German educational system was pretty good in the natural science and things like this. We had a shorter period of school until the end of high school, I would say. Gymnasium was 12 years, in the West it was 13 years. But what was a big difference was that the East German school system was ideologized in all parts. So our history lessons were, of course, ideologized. We were taught the communist view of the history and focused on this communist view. And the school was also used for propaganda in East Germany. And of course, there was no free speech in the school. And people knew, students knew in East Germany what you can say in your private and your family and with what you can talk about with your friends, but what you better wouldn't talk about in schools. The school was used by the regime also to form future communists and to form future followers. And that was a very clear goal of the educational system. We also had paramilitary education in East Germany in the school. So from 9th grade on, you had to learn how to shoot, and that was taught as the goal to defend your communist country against the capitalists from West Germany or from America. So it was a lot of propaganda in the school. And the school was also used for disciplining people who were thinking openly in opposition to the government and to the Communist Party. not only your achievement in school played a role, whether you could study after school, but also your loyalty to the communist government. And so the most important thing for higher education was your loyalty to the communist government, not your achievements. I was a pretty good student, but I wasn't loyal to the communist government, and I wasn't a member of the communist youth movement. So I was prevented from higher education. My education ended at 10th grade. So that was a big difference to the West.
Could there exist a government that protects its citizens without the need for control? If so, how would that look like?
I think there is a difference between controlling the people or setting rules. And that's the most important difference between a dictatorship who controls its people and a democracy where there are rules who have to be controlled, of course, but not in the way that they are controlled against the people. Of course, every society needs rules, because if you don't have rules, we have anarchy, and that works only when there are good people, and only good people, and everybody wants the best of the other. And we all are selfish in some ways, and we want our own ways. So you need rules, rules who secure that the interests of the others are respected like your interests, and the rights of the others are respected as your rights are respected. So, and we have in a democracy great mechanisms to prevent government to control the people in its own interest. We have the separation of powers, we have courts, we have parliaments, we have the government. They control each other, and that's why I would say, yes, we can govern a society which protects its citizens' interests and rights without controlling them. But we have rules.
Have you ever had an experience where the perspective you were taught in school changed year to year or even teacher to teacher?
That's an interesting question, indeed. Well, people are learning individuals, and in an open society, perspectives can change. Yes, over years or sometimes over days or weeks. However, when I grew up in East Germany, I experienced an ideology who was not able and willing to learn from the circumstances. And that's the difference between a dictatorship and an ideology opposite to a free society. A free society you enjoy here in America, we enjoy in Germany, is a learning society. And we change views. Your parents or your great-parents were thinking very differently about gay marriages or rights of minorities or other things. And we learn every day, every week, every month, every year that there are different views and they will influence our view. So the most dramatic change of views of many people were when more than 30 years ago, the communist regime in Germany, in East Germany, was brought down by the people. So people experienced a new freedom, they experienced a new society, and most of them embraced this new society and the new way of life and governing and talking and discussing. So this was the most dramatic experience of change. But as I said, in a free society, you will never stick to everything what you know. There's always always a development. That's very healthy for us as individuals as well as us as societies.
The success of Monday demonstrations in Leipzig can be partially attributed to the coverage that they were getting in Western news. Were East Germans ever worried that their Western news were actually fake news? And were there any instances when the East German government interfered with the Western broadcast?
Well, of course, the success of the peaceful revolution in East Germany was foremost a success of the people who were brave and went out to the streets and demonstrated against the regime which suppressed its own people. But you're right, in a time when we didn't have internet, smartphones, social media, etc., it was very crucial how to spread the news. And of course, the East German radio and TV stations wouldn't cover the demonstrations, at least in the beginning, because the broadcast was controlled by the regime. So for this reason, it was important that West German media reported about the uprising in East Germany. The term fake news we didn't know in this time. And we weren't worried about fake news from West German television. No, people in East Germany trusted very much the news media from the West, not only in this time, also before. And that was a very special situation that many of the East Germans who were not able to travel to the West were able to receive West German news and West German television. So it was important indeed that they would bring the news to the people in East Germany and also to support them by bringing these news and encouraging them to join the people who went out on the streets. We knew, however, that the East German news were always censored and often pure propaganda. The East German TV tried to name the West German TV fake news, fake new media. There was even a TV show, the Black Channel, the Schwarze Kanal, which showed little clips of West German media coverage, news coverage, and commented in the propaganda speech of East Germany. But East Germans knew that if there were fake news, again, this terminus we didn't know, but if there was propaganda and fake news, that was not in the West German media, but in the East German. Well, in one part, it ended the ideologic influence into the educational system. This was in East Germany, and the classes about Marxism, Leninism were abolished, and we concentrated on other things. Also, the history lessons changed, the curricula changed. But the German educational system is not uncomplicated. We don't have a central educational system. Each of the 16 states in Germany have their own curricula, and there is exchange between the states, but they differ from one state to the other. So that was also the case after the wall came down then in East Germany. Before, it was a centralized educational system. The orders came from Berlin, and now the states, the 5 states in East Germany, had to develop new curricula. They were advised and supported by colleagues from the West who had experienced the West German school system, but they had to learn. What changed in even the West German, in some of the West German states, was that school time which was in East Germany 12 years, in the West 13 years, more and more changed to 12 years, even in the West. So you were able to study even in younger years. But there were a lot of changes. And of course, you don't have so many teachers. So you had to deal with all teachers from East Germany who might have supported the regime before. So some of them had to leave schools because the students didn't want to rely on those people anymore. And the teachers also had to embrace the new circumstances. And that was not just easy for many of those teachers who were not all of them communists, but they somehow arranged with the system and they had to learn many things new. So also the language classes changed. In East Germany, everybody had to learn Russian. Not because there were so many opportunities to use Russian. We were not able to travel the Soviet Union or to be in contact with the Russian soldiers who were stationed in East Germany. But it was an ideological decision to order all East German students to learn Russian. Now people wanted to learn English, French, and other languages because the world opened for the East Germans. So all these issues played a role when the new system had to be rebuilt.
Society where most aspects of life are controlled by the government and citizens have very little control. Do you think that citizens would feel like they don't serve a purpose?
That would probably be the goal of the government, to steal them their purpose of life. But no, even in the dictatorships, people have the feeling that they serve a purpose. They might be frustrated with the situation. They might be devastated sometimes. They might be desperate. But of course, in dictatorships as well, they built families, they had children. They taught their children what is right and wrong. They built houses, they built friendships. They tried to use the little freedom they have to build communities. And of course, even in suppression, people can find and have a purpose. And sometimes the purpose is also to be aware that that is not right what this government does, and hope that the moment will come when you can rise up against this oppression, as people in whole Eastern Europe experienced in the late 80s of the last century. So yes, people have a purpose, and they find the purpose of their life, even though it is much more difficult often.
Have you ever had to withhold or hide a strong personal belief due to fear of how others would perceive you, such as your teachers or classmates?
Indeed, this was an experience what most youngsters in East Germany had. I mean, my teachers and my classmates knew that my father is a minister and I'm an active member of the church, and I'm, for this reason alone, in opposite of the regime in East Germany. But students in East Germany, and adults as well, they knew and they learned it from their very young years on that you can say everything in any circumstances or at any time. So it was very clear that publicly you would withhold your beliefs, religious beliefs, or your view of the situation, the economic, the political situation in East Germany, and that you wouldn't, it was very clear that it can be dangerous to be too open. not only that you could fail to get a higher education, you could lose your job, even when you were too critical against the regime. And so this was a typical experience of everybody. And we learned it from very young on that there is a sphere where you can trust the people, but the public sphere is no place where you can trust that what you say will not be held against you.
How are the approaches to teaching about the Nazis different from West Germany to East Germany?
There were big differences. It was difficult for both parts to accept responsibility, and they dealt very differently, the West and the East. In the West, it took many years until the 60s that there was a more open discussion about the role of the common German and the responsibility of the whole society for what had happened during the Nazi regime. And it took even longer to realize and to verbalize the whole Holocaust. But they taught it openly and in a responsible way in the schools, the longer the more. And it was a part of the societal recognition to talk about the Nazi time. In East Germany, of course, we were taught about the Nazis and their cruelties, and that they invaded the Soviet Union and that they killed millions of people, and that there was not much resistance against the Nazis. The most resistance that what we were taught about came from the communists. And the communists basically were the ones who suffered the most under the Nazis. They were killed in the concentration camps, etc. And for this reason, now East Germany is the country which unites the anti-Nazis, and all the Nazis who were left live in the West and they came in power again. That was the story we were told about the Nazis. There were no recognition that in East Germany, even in some governmental positions in the beginning, there were Nazis. And of course, in the society lived people who supported Hitler in the time before. That was not the topic. And even the Holocaust was not the topic it should have been, even in East Germany. Yes, there was recognition that the Jews were killed, but still, the group of people who suffered the most were the communists. That's what we learned in school in East Germany. Thank God, I grew up in a different environment in the church, and we talked, when I was a youngster, a lot about the Holocaust and the responsibility normal Germans had for the Holocaust and the Second World War. But that was not part of the official history of East Germany.
Do you agree that as control of the people increases, the less likely it is that the government is doing it for the benefit of the people? Does this hold true? And if so, did it only hold true in East Germany, or was it generally the case in all East Bloc countries?
This is a very interesting question. The Eastern Bloc countries were in their control and in their functioning and also in the organization of the dictatorship very comparable. So, and I'm very sure that the more the control increases, indeed, It is a sign that it serves less the people than the people in general, than those who are in power, which were the communist governments and parties in the Eastern Bloc countries. And yes, you can, if you look into the history, you can see that increased control is a shift from serving the people into serving their own interest of the governing people and of the people in power. There were many, many people after the war who were convinced that a socialist communist system in Germany will serve the people. They wanted to serve the people, and they wanted to have chances for everybody. And some ideas, socialist ideas, sound and are interesting for a just society and for just chances for everybody. And ideas of a society which is much closer to each other than other societies. A society with less poor people, and of course, less rich people. However, many of those people who have ideals and started as socialists or communists after the war were driven out of power because they were idealists and they really wanted to serve the people. And those who had their own power in their focus, who wanted to save their own power, who wanted to rule the country, who wanted a dictatorship which secures their power, they pushed them out. They even put their former allies into prisons. And for this reason, I would say, yeah, increasing control is a sign of a shifting in the governing for more control of the people and not governing in their interest.
What were you taught in East Germany about German history, and how is that different from what was taught in West Germany?
We had parts of our curricula in the school which were very similar to the West, particularly the natural science lessons were sometimes even better than in the West, very thoroughly taught, and I remember these classes very fondly. But there was a big part of East German education which was used for ideological indoctrination and for propaganda. And that was the case particularly in history lessons. So we were taught history from a, let's say, communist perspective. And so we didn't learn that much about Rome and Greece and the old history. We didn't learn that much about German medieval history. We learned much about the communist movement and how it evolved in the 19th century and in the 20th century. And all parts of history were taught to us in this view. And most of the years of history lessons were used to learn the history of the Soviet Union, the Eastern Bloc, and what the communists achieved in the world. So that was very, very different.
Have you ever experienced a form of propaganda in your schools?
Basically every day. Propaganda was part of my school experience. We had a class twice a week. It was called Staatsbürgerkundeunterricht, Citizens Education, Pure Communist Propaganda, and you wouldn't disagree with the teacher because you would get in trouble for doing that. History lessons were part of the propaganda, and it was expected that every student joins the Communist Youth Movement, the FDJ, which had afternoons where they discussed the great communist achievements, and they published even little newspapers which praised the communist regime and our communist leaders. And we had frequently flag roll calls in the courtyard of our school, where the whole school had to stand and listen to propaganda speeches of our principal, and where even students were singled out who had disagreed with the communist regime. So this was part of our school, everyday school.
The FDJ was a prominent youth organization that was sponsored by the East German government. Do you think that youth should be actively involved in political and current issues? What role does the government play in encouraging youth activism? And ultimately, what role does activism play in an ideal society?
I for 100% agree that young people should be involved in society and politics in their neighborhood, definitely. But definitely not in the way the FDJ, the Communist Youth Movement, did. That was basically an organization governed by the Communist Party to form the future Communist Party's members and to indoctrinate students, but not to raise them as free and active citizens. Basically, you were told what to do in the FDJ and not told, find your own way, be active, live your convictions, support your neighbors, your community, be politically active. Being politically active in East Germany was dangerous. What they wanted to have were followers. Having said that, that is one lesson I learned from East Germany, and you can learn from East Germany too. It is always worth it to be active and engaged in your society. And it is a great gift that you can grow up in a free society, and you should use your rights to be part of the society and the democratic system. Vote. Be a member of a party. Run for office, because a country is as good as its people are able and willing to work for the common good. And you can't be too young to do that. And that's why I can only encourage everybody who lives in a democratic country to use the rights to be engaged in the society politically, but also in the community where you grow up, and in your school as well. That's a good field to learn for times when you are able to run for office.
What were or have been the greatest obstacles to overcome in order to unify the East and West of Germany? How have tensions between East and West Germans been eased? And how can really, when can two countries be considered to be unified?
Well, let's begin with the end of your question, which is not so easy to answer. Countries, the bigger they are, the more diverse they are. You experience this in your own country. There are big, big differences between New York and Utah, or California and Wisconsin. And there are differences in Germany too, between the North and the South and the West and the East. And 30 years after reunification, there are not only, or there not necessarily the differences bigger between West and East than between South and North. So that is maybe a sign of that unification somehow worked in Germany. It is also a comparability of the life circumstances. So people should enjoy the same rights, of course, and that they enjoyed from the beginning, but also the chances should be comparable. Of course, there are differences between big cities and rural countrysides, but the chances for the people should be the same. And that's what we worked in Germany very hard on over the last 30 years. So you asked for the biggest obstacles. The biggest obstacle was probably the economic change in East Germany. East Germany was for decades not compatible to the West, and the whole economic system crumbled after the wall fell. So all the big factories, the car manufacturing, the chemical industries, all these huge economic parts had to shut down because people didn't want to buy the outdated cars which were produced in East Germany. The chemical industry produced with high environmental costs, etc. So millions of East Germans lost their jobs overnight. And these jobs were not just replaced by new jobs. And that's why the 90s were a very hard time for many, many East Germans, because they didn't have a perspective to take part in the new uprising and the new development in East Germany. Thank God, East Germany reunited with West Germany, a very rich country. And so many billions of Deutschmarks and later euros went from the West to the East to support a rebuild of the economy. It was not only the infrastructure, but also real new factories. And even today, we don't have the same situation in East Germany economically like in the West, but we closed the gap much more. The same was a problem with the pensions of the people. They had paid East German money in a pension system. Now they needed West German hard currency to receive the pension. So there was transferred billions of money to the East. And also there, the gap closed pretty much, but still the pension in the East is very few percent lower than in the West, even 30 years after reunification. So you feel there is still not everything united, but the country is united, I would say.
I wanted to know if there was any reason, so like, why East Germany seemed to be hit a lot less harder in how religious they were than something like the Czech Republic.
There were many differences between the Eastern Bloc countries. Look at Poland. Poland, even during communist times, more than 90% of the people were members of the church. Poland was a totally Catholic country. It was, of course, helpful that one of the popes came from Poland during this time. That made the Polish Catholic Church even more influential. But they somehow had arranged with both parts, and somehow it worked. But you're right, Czechoslovakia went very hard on the churches. I had a godfather who was a minister in Czechoslovakia, and compared with them, we experienced great freedom. It was not freedom. I talked about the situation of the churches, but in Czechoslovakia, they really silenced the churches. It was a very small percentage of people who still went to church. And they were very, very successful because they made the life of churchgoers hard. I don't know the real reason why it worked. I'm very sure the special situation in East Germany was that there was always a connection between West and East, between the people, between families, friends, between the churches in the West and the East. And that played a significant role, that it was not so easy to abolish all religious communities, etc. And in the later years of East Germany, the churches, even though they were considered as in opposition to the regime, helped to negotiate between West and East in several fields. So I think this was one reason that there were a different approach to the churches and a different result in Czechoslovakia and in East Germany.
Responding to the last question, do you think that the church should have had a bigger role during the time of the day-to-day and everything, or do you think that it had the right amount of influence on what was happening, or do you think it should have had less of an influence or say?
I don't wish this for anybody to experience it, but that's an experience of churches, of a religious community, that in times of suppression, your influence in the society is not that big, but the people, but your influence and your what it means for the individual, but to be part of this community is much more important than in time of freedom and you can choose whatever you want to do. So people who really stick to their church and to their religious community got much more out of this relationship, of this community. It was much more important for the individuals to be part of this community, because this community, this congregation, gave them a shield against all the suppression from outside, the pressure of this school, of the party, of whatever. And so people were much more committed to be part of this community. This is an experience it's still important for me, and it still shapes my relationship to my church, even though it's 30 years ago and I live in a total different society and the role of the church is very different.
Was there a lot of opposition from people to reunification?
I wouldn't say a lot, but there was a significant number of people who had discussion during 1990, after the wall fell and reunification. It was the span of 11 months, who thought, let's use the chance of the end of the communist regime to build something new. We don't want the we don't want the communist regime back, and we don't just adapt to the West German system. We should go slowly, and we should try out some economic, political ideas which might be better for a society than the pure capitalism, which we don't have in Germany. We have a social market system and the communist regime in East Germany. But this group became smaller and smaller and less influential because the vast majority of the East Germans wanted to reunite. And for many reasons, for emotional reasons, for economic reasons, of course. By the way, the reunification of the currency happened even before the reunification of the country. Already in July, 3 months before the reunification of the country, we had the same currency, which was also a very great support from the West for the East. So, but people didn't want to have new experiments. They wanted to live in the country. They knew through the West German media, and so the vast majority in East Germany was pro-reunification. Having said that, there was, on the West side, not everybody was just excited for reunification. There were fear that it will be too expensive, and how can we manage this, etc. There was a big discussion, and it was one reason why Helmut Kohl, he was the chancellor in this time, the head of the conservative CDU, won this election because his opponent, Oscar Lafontaine, from the Social Democrats, he openly questioned if the reunification would be the right time. And that people in the East held against him because they said that's a historic chance that our country can reunite, also with the blessings of the former World War II opponents, the Americans, the French, the Brits, the Soviet Union. They all agreed to the reunification, and so it was the right time and the right thing to do.